Hello, my name is Byron Weber-Becker. I'm pleased to be presenting about electoral reform to PACS 302, Math for Good and Evil. A little bit about me. I'm a lecturer in computer science here at the University of Waterloo. I've been involved with electoral reform for probably a decade. I'm sure it's more than a decade. And part of that has involved modeling our current electoral system as well as potential replacements for it using computer simulations. And I've testified to parliamentary committees on that. I'm also involved in preparing a legal case to try and show that first past the post, our current electoral system, is in fact unconstitutional. So in this presentation, what I'd like to do is, first of all, start out by asking what are some appropriate electoral reform principles, and then ask what electoral systems other countries are using. Then we'll get into the meat of it. How do these electoral systems work? We'll look at a number of them, including the one that Canada currently uses. Finally, we'll come back to those principles again and ask how do they deliver on those principles. And then I'd like to look at most recent work with Charter Challenge, this court case that's trying to prove that first past the post is in fact unconstitutional. And close with a summary, which you'll probably understand by then, about why I support proportional representation as a replacement for our current electoral system. So let's start in on those principles. These are principles that were enunciated by a parliamentary committee set up by Mr. Trudeau after the 2015 election. And that's a pretty thick wall of text, so let's break that down. It breaks down into 5 categories, and I'd like to add a 6th that I think they missed. First one is effectiveness and legitimacy. It basically needs to fairly translate our votes into representatives in Parliament. Seems like a pretty core principle. Secondly is engagement. We'd like our electoral system to encourage voting, or at a bare minimum, not to discourage voting because people feel like there's no point. Their vote doesn't count. We'd like it ideally to foster greater civility and collaboration in politics rather than the incivility that we see in sort of the fighting that we see so often now. Ideally, it would enhance social cohesion. We sometimes see the Eastern Canada and Western Canada at odds with each other. Part of that, not all, but part of that might be attributable to our current electoral system. And we'd like to see it include underrepresented groups. All of that fits into the engagement piece. We'd like it to be, to avoid undue complexity. We'd like it simple is better. But would also like it to be complex enough, as complex as it needs to be to respect those other principles. And I think for our purposes, this is basically a non-issue. All of the systems that we're going to be looking at from the voter's point of view will be simple enough to understand. Voting system should have integrity. It should safeguard the trust in the electoral process and give reliable and verifiable results. And again, this is going to be a non-issue for these. It'll be the case for all of the systems that we look at today. In Canada, we have a history of preferring local representation. There are some countries, like Israel, for example, where a representative represents the entire country. They're elected at large. That just doesn't wash in Canada. We have a history of being able to meet and talk with a local representative. And indeed, for many years, my local representative literally lived a block down the street that way from me. And I was likely to encounter her on the sidewalk, walking the dog, whatever. And part of that is accountable. An MP is accountable to a specific local group of people. It also makes them accessible. It also makes sure that that MP understands the local conditions and can advance local priorities. So that's an overview of the principles that were set out for that parliamentary committee that Mr. Trudeau set up after the 2015 election. There's one more principle that I think they missed, and that is that our electoral system should yield good governance. It should elect a stable government that doesn't flip-flop back and forth on policies, that is able to advance agendas, and governments that enact long-lasting policies that that are supported by the majority of the voters. Enough of this flip-flopping, like we're just seeing in the United States, where Biden came in and threw out all of Trump's policies. Trump's legislative agenda for the whole time he was in office was to throw out Obama's policies. So part of that is sort of the flip-flopping back and forth. And if we can avoid that with our electoral system, I think we'll get better governance. So let's take a brief overview of the types of electoral systems. They fall into two separate, the ones we'll look at will fall into two different families. One family is the winner-take-all systems, and the other is proportional systems. In the winner-take-all systems, we have first-past-the-post, which is what Canada currently uses. There's another system that has been suggested, is probably preferred by Mr. Trudeau, and that is alternative vote. In the proportional families, we'll have multi-member systems, mixed member systems, and you'll see here that there's actually multiple systems that fall into a mixed member and multiple systems that fall into multi-member. We'll also take a brief look at a system called rural-urban proportional, which is a system that has been developed for Canada to solve some of the problems that multi-member and mixed member face in Canada's unique situation. But first, who's using what? I'd like to look at democracies that score very high on the UN's Human Development Index. In other words, these are democracies where you'd actually want to live, where you would choose to live. Places like Canada, the United States, most of Europe, and a number of other places as well. First of all, who's using winner-take-all systems? Well, first past the post, it's the United States, Canada, Singapore, United Kingdom. There's an alternative vote that's used in Australia, and France, Bahrain, and Belarus use some other systems that are winner-take-all but don't fall neatly into one of those camps. In terms of proportional representation, all of these. Proportional representation is far from an outlier. In fact, it's used far more frequently in these democracies where you want to live than is first past the post. Canada is in fact the outlier on this one. There's also a couple of systems, South Korea, Japan, Andorra, Lithuania, that are using parallel systems. We won't get into that. So let's take a look at these electoral systems. Let's start with first past the post. As I've mentioned many times, Canada uses first past the post now. The basic principle is that in each riding, the candidate with the most votes wins. And all of those different ridings, subdivisions within Canada, have their own independent election, independent of all the others. And that's what leads to problems. One of those problems is that it's an unstable system. If you think about stability in a mathematical sense, you know, you graph it and it goes, it's really wild. Okay? So let's take a look at an example. Suppose you've got 100 voters and they're divided up into 5 ridings. Among those 100 voters, you've got 40 Liberals, 35 Conservatives, and 25 NDPers. In one election, you might end up with this. Here's one riding, a second riding, a third riding, and so on. Remember, each of these have an independent election. And so in the first riding, we have these Liberal voters, or these voters voting Liberal, these voters voting Conservative, and these voters voting NDP. Similarly, in riding 5, we have these voters voting Liberal, Conservative, and NDP. Because these are all independent of each other, okay, the distribution, the sort of random distribution makes things come out about right. And we end up with 2 Liberal MPs, 2 Conservative MPs, and an NDP MP, which, given the 100 voters, is about what you'd expect. But that was just sort of a variation of voters that gives the right result sometimes. We might have other variations, other distributions of voters. So consider this distribution, where all of the voters are distributed uniformly across the ridings. And so in every riding, we have 40% who vote Liberal. We have 35% that vote Conservative and 25% that vote NDP. And thus, in every riding, the 40% Liberal is greater than any of the others, and the Liberal wins, and we have 5 Liberal MPs, and nobody representing the Conservative voters, nobody representing the NDP voters. And you might say, well, the Liberals did have more voters than anybody else, so maybe it's right that they get all of the MPs. But with a different distribution of voters, it could go the other way. Consider this, where the Liberal voters are distributed uniformly across the 5 ridings, but the Conservative and the NDP are not. Conservatives have their bastions of strength out in the west, the NDP have their bastions of strength out in the east, and the result is that the Conservatives win in these 3 ridings, the NDP win in these 2 ridings, and the Liberals don't get any seats at all, in spite of the fact that the Liberals had more votes than anybody else. So the moral of the story is that first past the post is very dependent on the distribution of voters across those ridings. And as a result, first past the post results are often unfair. So here's results from the 2015 federal election. The Liberals earned 40% of the votes, but they got 54% of the seats in Parliament. And that gave them 100% of the power in Parliament. That surplus of voters here came at the expense, just a little bit, of the Conservatives, even more so at the expense of the NDP, where the NDP got 20% of the votes, but only 13% of the MPs, and also especially at the expense of the Greens, where they got 3% of the votes, but only 0.3% of the MPs. That's called a false majority. The Liberals got a majority of the MPs, but did not have a majority of the votes. It was pretty much the same thing in the election before that. When Stephen Harper won, notice that it's only the colors that have changed here. The length of the bars barely changed at all. Okay? And it ends up that these false majorities are quite common in Canada. In 2019, we have an interesting case in that the Liberals got 33% of the votes. The Conservatives got 34% of the votes. The Conservatives got more votes than the Liberals did. And yet the Liberals got 46% of the seats. The Conservatives only got 36% of the seats. That's called a wrong winner, okay? Where one party got more MPs but fewer votes. Those differences, of course, came at the expense of the NDP and the Greens. Notice here that the NDP got twice as many votes as the Bloc, and yet the Bloc got more seats. Again, that's because of the distribution of the voters. And we might notice here that the Bloc and the Greens got almost exactly the same number of votes, but the Bloc got 10% of the MPs while the Greens got only 1%. Again, that's due to the distribution of the voters. The Bloc is concentrated in Quebec, while the Greens are spread out all across the country. Canadian government since 1930 fully 50% of them have been false majorities. Only 15% have been true majorities. The remaining 35% have been a minority government like Mr. Trudeau has now. First past the post can be really unfair. You might say, well, those distributions, those wild distributions, those never happen. But they do happen. In 1987 in New Brunswick, the distribution of the voters gave, now this was a provincial result, the Liberals gained 60% of the seats. That's more than half, grant you. But they did, in fact, get 100% of the seats in Parliament. Now think about that for a moment. 100% of the seats in one party. There was no opposition. Where are the brakes on that party to do what they want to do? There isn't any. Where is the government in waiting? How can the opposition credibly claim to be ready to rule after the next election if they have nobody in Parliament to practice, to maintain their skills, to build their skills? First past the post often magnifies regional differences. If we look at, for example, Toronto, in 2015 election, 100% of the MPs went to the Liberals, in spite of the fact that the Liberals only got 52% of the votes. This hides the fact that 48% of the voters in Toronto voted some other way, either NDP or Conservative or Green. Okay? Same thing here in the Maritimes. In the Alberta, which we typically think of as a bastion of conservatism, the fact is that, the Conservatives get 85% of the seats, but only 60% of the population actually voted that way. The other 40% voted for something else. Another side effect is that first past the post tends to elect fewer women. And in fact, other groups. Okay? If we compare first past the post with proportional representation systems, we see that systems with proportional representation, by and large, tend to elect more women. Those at the bottom of this pile are the winner-take-all systems. Why is that? In a winner-take-all system, you want to put the person that you think has the best shot forward. And that, in our patriarchal society, is often a white male. Okay? Because you've only got one chance. In a proportional representation system, as we'll see, you often have multiple chances to elect somebody, and so you can put forward a more diverse slate. In the winner-take-all systems, politics tends to be more bruising, and it could very well be that women just don't want to put up with that and are more reluctant to put themselves forward. With first past the post, you often get an MP that is not somebody that you voted for. In fact, oftentimes about 51% of us, more than 50% of us, get an MP that is not the person that we voted for. And that hurts our representation. I remember a time, once upon a time, when I became very interested in income inequalities and went to talk with my local MP, whom I did not vote for, about income inequality. And he listened very politely. He engaged with me. But it was also very clear that my concerns would not be represented by that MP in Parliament. And so I left that meeting feeling like I was not being represented, that I wished my MP was more like-minded with me. And with first past the post, in a winner-take-all system where only one person wins to represent a whole body of people, that's going to leave a bunch of us out. Policy lurch is often a byproduct of first past the post, as I mentioned in my earlier introduction. We have, in recent past, we've had a government sign on to an environmental treaty and then drop out of environmental treaty, and the next government signs on again. Or cancels the long-form census and brings back the long-form census. Or cancel veterans' monthly pensions, and then restores the monthly pensions. These are all examples from Canada's recent history. And with other systems where you are forced to build more of a consensus across parties and represent a larger percentage of the voters, you don't have this policy lurch. And if you think about some of the things that we hold most valuable in Canadian society, like our medical care system right now, that was something that was developed while Canada had a minority government and needed to reach out to other parties and build a consensus that represented a larger fraction of voters than just, say, the 40% that voted for the party that happened to gain power. This graph builds on some of the work that I did and presented to the Parliamentary Committee in 2016. What I did was simulate some elections under a number of different scenarios and showed how proportional or improportional they were. Okay? And so in this graph, this is based on the 2015 election. And this is the data from that election right here, right, from that actual election. And what this shows is that the dark light line here are the number of votes that the Liberals earned, the percentage of votes that the Liberals earned, and the light line here is the percentage of seats that they got, that they were rewarded with those votes. And so you see there's a gap here. And ideally in a fair system, we'd like that gap to be as small as possible. Okay. Here with the Conservatives, there's a fairly small gap. That's good. But then with the NDP, there's a larger gap again, and so on. What happens here is that this says what happens if votes shift from the NDP to the Liberals. In other words, the Liberals got even more votes than they did. Well, then that gap widens it increases faster than actually the votes that shift to them. And if votes shift from the Liberals to the NDP, in other words, fewer votes for the Liberal, then that gap narrows, of course. But what this does is shows that under these simulations, it's really reinforcing the instability of our electoral system, that votes shifting around increase or decrease these gaps in proportionality, which is not what we're looking for. So that was first past the post. Let's talk now about another winner-take-all system, which is alternative vote. It uses something called a ranked ballot. Now, first of all, I want to say a ranked ballot is not synonymous with alternative vote. Many people think that it is. A ranked ballot is merely a tool that is used in many different electoral systems. What is a ranked ballot? Well, it's where rather than just putting an X, you can say, here's my first choice, my second choice, my third choice candidate. You're often not required to rank everybody. You can just rank your first choice one if you want, but you're best off ranking as many as you have opinions about. Then when it's counted, the candidate with the least votes is dropped, and those ballots are redistributed to the next ranked candidate. And you repeat until someone has 50% plus one. So in this example here, this voter voted for the Green candidate, Gary Gronow, okay, and perhaps it becomes obvious after tallying up all the votes that he's got the fewest votes, not going to win. So then take this ballot and put it onto this voter's second choice, Lily Laverty, the Liberals pile. And it could be that it becomes obvious as the votes are counted that the Liberal will not win either, and then this might be transferred over to the Conservatives pile. So let's take a look at how that works. Here's a scenario The Conservative got 38% of the first choice ballots. The NDP got 29%, the Liberal candidate got 26%, and so on for the others. Okay. So what happens? The independent candidate has the fewest votes, and so that candidate is dropped, and those are put onto the piles for the voters' next choice. So let's imagine that that might be half of them for the Conservative and half of them for the Greens. So now the Green has 6% of the ballots, the Conservative has 39% of the ballots. The Green candidate is now the one that is farthest behind, gets dropped, and those ballots are distributed. So now let's imagine that 5% of those green ballots go to the Liberal candidate and 1% goes to the Conservative candidate. So now the NDP is the last one and gets dropped. We can imagine that 21% of those go to the Liberals, and then the Liberal wins in this election, in spite of the fact that the Liberal was the third place candidate in those initial votes, in those initial ballots. This is because people are given the opportunity to say who the second and third choice is. In first past the post, if you just count the ballots, and only take into account the first choice, well, it's not collecting as much information as the ranked ballot does. And this allows people to express their support for other candidates and to make use of that. So this sounds pretty good. It's attractive, and it's easy to see why people might want to have this kind of a voting system. But you can also have the wrong winners. Okay, so here with this scenario, I have second choices listed underneath here. So the Conservative votes this way: 5% for the NDP, 35% for the Liberal, and so on. And so here, if we look at this, the Liberals have only 26% here, but look at the depth of their second choice support. Lots of depth here, here, some here, and so on. So it feels like the Liberals perhaps ought to come out very well here, given the depth of their second. They're not the first choice of nearly as many people as others, but they're the second choice of many. And so if you look at that first or second choice, Liberals get 90%. Okay. So the independent drops off, goes to the NDP. The Greens drop off. And note here now that because of this unfortunate split in those first two drops, the unfortunate split here and here, the Liberal now trails the NDP in spite of having that very rich first and second place votes. So now the Liberals are dropped off. Okay? And after that, well, who knows who wins. Okay? But the point being that the alternative vote can give strange results as well as first past the post. And this is an example of that. And again, this is not just a theoretical possibility. It does happen in practice as well. So if you look at this, if you model it, it usually gives the same winner as first past the post. When it does not, it favors the larger parties over the smaller parties. It favors the centrist parties over the other parties, okay, which perhaps explains why the Liberals would really like the alternative vote. Okay. And simulations using the 2015 election data gives the Liberals 213 seats instead of 184. In other words, it overrepresented them even more. Which leads, of course, to unfair results, limited diversity, and many voters without a like-minded representative. Here are the simulations like we saw before. This gap right in here is even greater than what we saw on the previous chart. The Gallagher index down here, by the way, is a measure, it's essentially a least squares measure that measures the difference between what's proportional from a party perspective and what was actually achieved. And of course here, higher scores are bad, lower scores are good. So how did these winner-take-all systems do against our values that we talked about before? In terms of fairly translating votes into representatives, doesn't do very well. In fact, we saw how unstable it is. It can give wrong winners and false majorities. In terms of engagement, encouraging voting, it actually discourages voting because if you're in a riding where that's a safe riding for one party or another, there's really very little incentive to vote. If your party is behind, if your preferred candidate is behind, there's very little incentive to vote. Okay? Does it foster greater civility and collaboration? Well, no, because of that instability in the voting, swinging a very few votes can actually have a dramatic consequence on the election. And so that makes the MPs and the parties looking for, constantly trashing each other and looking for an opportunity to swing just enough voters to give them the majority in the next election. Does it enhance social cohesion? Well, no, because it magnifies the differences across Canada. And makes Toronto look far more liberal than it really is, and makes the West look far more conservative than it really is. One place where it wins is that it is dead simple. You go in and mark your favorite candidate and you're done. Okay? But it doesn't respect those other principles. It does safeguard the trust in the election process in that it's fairly easy to see that it does what it says it's supposed to do. It gives reliable, verifiable results. They're easy to check. That's all good. Does it ensure accountable MPs? Probably. You can throw them out in the next election. Does it ensure accessible, like-minded MPs? Well, no. Most of us, typically a slight majority of us, don't get somebody that we voted for. The MPs understand the local conditions and advance local needs. Well, they do for the voters that voted for them, but that might not be everybody. Does it yield stable governments? Well, it does in that it often gets a majority, and they can implement their legislative priorities because they've got majority. But they don't have to negotiate often with other parties and represent a broad section of the electorate. And so we have that policy lurch that we talked about, that they don't, in fact, typically enact long-lasting policies that are supported by the majority of the voters. So winner-take-all systems have a pretty mixed record on these values that we defined earlier. Let's shift now to proportional systems. We'll start with a multi-member system. What multi-member systems typically do is combine several of our current ridings into one riding and elect the same total number of MPs. So let's look at a local example. For example, Waterloo Region. In the 2015 election and in the 2019 election, those 5 ridings elected 4 Liberals and 1 Conservative, as we saw here. If we combined, though, those 5 ridings into one large riding and still elected 5, would it still be 4-1? If we looked at how people actually voted in the 2015 election, 46% voted Liberal but we got 80% Liberal MPs. 36% voted Conservative, 14 NDP, and so on. So if we were to allocate those 5 MPs proportionally to the votes, we'd get something more like this. 2 Conservatives, 2 Liberals, and an NDP. Now, it's not quite exactly proportional. There's rounding errors because we're trying to get things down into 5 MPs. But this would be as close as we can come. The Liberals would be slightly underrepresented, the Conservatives would be slightly overrepresented, and the NDP would be slightly overrepresented. Unfortunately, the Greens would not get in. So how might we do this? There's actually a number of different ways to do it. One way is a closed list. So what happens with a closed list, the parties would typically rank their candidates in order, and the voters would vote for a party. So here, voted for Conservative, and then we count up those ballots and say, okay, based on the ballots, we need 2 Conservatives. And so it would take the top 2 people off the Conservative list. This hasn't typically flown very well in Canada because there's a distrust in the parties, and the voters would like to have a bigger say in how those lists are ordered. One way to do that is an open list. And so you could have the candidates listed on the ballot, and the candidates with the most votes, say that the votes for the Liberals, say we need 2 Liberal MPs, and then the 2 Liberals that got the most votes would actually end up representing. So here, if Lily Laverty got 30% of the votes and Logan Long got 10% of the votes, well, those 2 would end up being the Liberal MPs in this open list system. There's also a way to do it called single transferable vote that is very much like the alternative vote that we had before. The ballots are transferred to lower ranked candidates when it becomes obvious that your first choice, your top ranked candidate, can't win. So for example, on this one again, if it becomes obvious that the Greens are not going to win in this election, then this ballot would be transferred first to this one. And if it becomes obvious that Lily's not going to win either, then the ballot is transferred to Larry, and so on until we're done. If we do the simulations like we saw before, we see that there's still a little bit of a bonus here for the party that gets the most votes. Okay? But by and large, it is pretty proportional, even as votes shift here from the way the votes were in the actual election to 10% of the votes shifting towards the Liberals, 20% shifting towards the Liberals, or 20% shifting away from the Liberals. In all of those scenarios, this single transferable vote system was still pretty proportional. That's a good thing. So that was the multi-member proportional representation systems. Like I said, several different ways to achieve proportionality using this idea of having a riding where you elect multiple members in that riding. Let's take a look now at mixed member proportional. Germany is the best known country that uses this system. In the mixed member proportion, you start out with single member ridings, like we have in Canada, embedded into a multi-member region. So let's take a look at Southern Ontario again. Here's Southern Ontario. Let's focus on this part in Northern Ontario here that includes Kitchener-Waterloo. In the 2015 election, this part of Ontario elected 245 Liberal MPs, and the rest of them were all Conservative. If we look at the votes here, the Liberals, it turns out, are now underrepresented. They got 42% of the votes, but only a third of the MPs. The Conservatives are way overrepresented. They got 41% of the votes, fewer votes than the Liberals, but 2/3 of the seats. The NDP got 12% of the votes, but no seats. The Greens got 5% of the votes and no seats. So if we expected proportionality of MPs to the votes, in other words, we expected that about 40% of the MPs would be Liberal and about 40% of the MPs would be Conservative and about 12% of the MPs would be NDP. What would that look like? Well, one way to achieve that would be to elect 15 MPs, the same as we just saw, but have 10 of them in single-member ridings, 5 of them in the region at large, and we choose the regional MPs, those 5 for the region at large, to ensure proportionality. So how would that be? Here I divided up the areas into the 15 ridings into 10, and let's just speculate that down here in Waterloo, Kitchener, Guelph, we would again elect Liberal MPs. Only 4 of them this time rather than 5 because, well, some of the ridings got amalgamated. And let's speculate that the other ridings would all elect Conservatives. But that leaves 5 MPs left over. How might we choose those to ensure proportionality? Well, to get this proportionality here, like this, would probably want 40% of the MPs, or 6, to be Liberal, 40% to be Conservative, 2 of them, or 13%, to be NDP, and 1 of them to be Green. So when we look at our map here and we say, well, we wanted 6 Conservative MPs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 of them were already elected in those single-member ridings. So they don't get any of these 5 extras. On the other hand, we also wanted to be proportional. We wanted 6 Liberal MPs. Only 4 of them were elected. And so 2 of these should end up being Liberal. 2 of the MPs should be NDP. They didn't get any elected in the single-member riding, so 2 of these should be NDP, and the last one should be a Green. So how does it work? Everyone has 2 votes in a mixed-member proportional system. The first vote is for the local riding and proceeds very much like Canada does now. You vote for your favorite candidate, okay? And the candidate in your riding with the most votes wins. But you also vote for a party. What's your party of choice? So you might really, really like the local Green candidate, but overall, as a person, as an MP, but overall, you might like the Liberal parties better. The Liberal Party's policies better. And so you can split your vote that way if you want to. This ballot is used to figure out who your local MP is going to be, and this ballot is used to figure out what the proportions should be for those compensatory MPs or those top-up seats. So how do you fill those regional seats? Well, one way would be to make an ordered list for each party of all of the candidates. You remove the candidates that won a local seat, and then take as many candidates as needed from the top of each party's list to make the results proportional. So, for example, we might imagine that the Conservatives, remember they needed 6 MPs to be proportional, they got 6. And the Liberals also wanted 6. Long, Laverty, LaRoque, and Lease got seats locally, and so would take Lawson and Lapp. If we do the simulations, as we did before, it again comes out pretty proportional because we have those regional MPs to make up the proportionality. The Gallagher index of 5.2 is really quite reasonable. Not all is rosy, however, with multi-member and mixed-member proportionality. With multi-member systems, the example where I gave here in Southern Ontario works pretty well. Having a riding that encompasses, the KW area plus Guelph is reasonable. We're small enough and we're dense enough where that can be a reasonable solution. But consider Northern BC. One of the ridings there is already larger than all of Poland. And if you combine that with 5 more ridings to come up with a single riding that is nearly 5 times the size of Poland, that's huge. That's too big an area to successfully represent, have one person successfully represent. At least that's the feeling. Okay. And even with mixed member proportional, needing to gather a bunch of ridings, combine them, and to get that larger riding that the single member ridings are embedded into, that larger riding can get very big. And so the question is, how do we deal with this problem of Canadian geography, where we have some places where people are very densely packed, like downtown Toronto, and some places where they are incredibly sparse. So that's the problem that rural-urban proportional system is designed to work at. Full disclosure, I was part of the team that worked on designing this system and put it forward. It was talked about in this parliamentary committee as an option, and it was also talked about in British Columbia in one of their processes to consider proportional representation. So, as I said, it's designed to grapple with this problem of voter density. Okay, so let's take Alberta as an example. Okay, here's Alberta as it currently stands, with I think it's 42 MPs elected. The vast majority of them are Conservative. There's a couple Liberals sprinkled in there, but as we saw earlier, that doesn't really, it overrepresents the Conservatives. Okay. So what would we do? Well, what we'd do is combine the features of multi-member systems and mixed-member systems. We would use the multi-member systems in the population centers that are dense, and it makes sense to combine ridings to come up with larger ridings, and would use mixed member systems in the less densely populated areas. So how would that work? So first of all, step 1, let's leave the huge ridings as single member ridings, pretty much like they are now. Step 2, let's combine those densely populated areas into multi-member ridings. Okay. So in Edmonton and Calgary here, we might divide up into, say, 5-member ridings, okay, 5 or 6-member ridings, as we've shown here in these breakouts. Okay. And then thirdly, we add some top-up seats to ensure proportionality, better proportionality, to compensate for these areas where we have only single-member ridings. And here are the top-up seats here and here, which indicating perhaps 2 Liberals and an NDP in the north of Alberta, and 2 NDP and a Liberal in the south part of Alberta. The advantage here over mixed member proportional is that you need fewer top-up seats. Mixed member proportional typically needs about 1/3 of the seats to be top-up seats, those at-large seats, in order to gain proportionality. And with with rural-urban proportional, it's feasible to enlarge Parliament by just 15% rather than a third. If we model it, it again comes out quite well, with relatively small gaps here between the number of votes earned and the number of seats that are rewarded for those votes. If we look at proportional representation systems, how do they do against the values that we looked at earlier? Well, in terms of fairly translating the votes into representatives, I think it does fairly well, because 40% of the votes turns into 40% of the MPs, plus or minus some rounding error. In terms of engagement, it encourages voting because every vote really does count. It makes a difference, and because in many of these systems, particularly a single transferable vote, you need to the second place and third place votes are often significant. It encourages candidates to reach out to the voters that might have somebody else as their first choice. And to do that, they need to treat the other candidates civilly. It tends to enhance social cohesion. We don't see that big disparity between Toronto being all liberal and the West being all conservative, for example, in spite of the fact that voters aren't that way. And it's more likely to include underrepresented groups. When you don't have all of your eggs in one basket, it's easier to put forward a more diverse slate. In fact, in single transferable vote, for example, if you have if you need to elect 5 MPs in your region, you can elect one of those with only about 20% of the vote. So if, say, you have 20% that are really concerned with the environment, those 20% ought to be able to coalesce around a candidate and get that candidate elected. Okay? Which gives much more diversity than you get with the first past the post system. One of the downfalls of proportional representation is that it is somewhat more complex than the others. But there are lots and lots and lots of countries that have figured out how to do it. And being able to rank your candidates, first, second, third, fourth choice, we do that ranking all the time. And it's not really that complex. And it does respect the other principles. Yeah. Does it lead to stable governments? Well, with proportional representation systems, it is less likely that you're going to have a majority government. And so you're going to need to form coalitions and reach out across party lines, but that results in stable, long-lasting policies, which is a good thing. And stable governments, proportional representation systems have this reputation of changing a lot, but in fact, they have elections at almost exactly the same frequency as Canada under first past the post. So that was a whirlwind tour of a bunch of different electoral systems, some of their pros and their cons. I'd like to shift now to some more recent work, and that is the Charter Challenge, which is a court case that is challenging the constitutionality of first past the post in Canada. The quote here is from the website of Charter Challenge. Since the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms was established in the 1980s, the courts have been ruling in favor of fair and equal representation in Canadian and provincial elections. Now it's time to challenge the fairness of the first past the post voting system itself. And this is a court case being brought by an organization in British Columbia, Fair Voting BC, as well as an organization in, I think it's New Brunswick, called Springtide. So what's the process? Well, first of all, you need to file a notice of application. In this case, to the Ontario Superior Court of Justice is where it was filed. That's been done. Second step is to prepare the case and secure witnesses. That is where we're at now. There will be a first hearing in the provincial court at some point in the future, likely an appeal, also in provincial court, and that will also likely be appealed by one side or the other. You then give an application for leave to the Supreme Court. In other words, you don't automatically get a hearing at the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court agrees to hear the case, then there would be a final appeal there. So what are the arguments? The arguments are based on Section 3 of the Charter and Section 15 of the Charter. Section 3 of the Charter says that every citizen has the right to vote. And decisions made by the court, by the Supreme Court, since the Charter of Rights and Freedoms come on, are heading in the direction that that right to vote is only meaningful if the votes are fair and equitable. Okay? That having the right to vote, having the right to go and make a check mark on your ballot has no meaning if the system is stacked against you such that that check mark really doesn't matter. The same person is going to be elected anyway. And so, so the hope is to say, well, first past the post doesn't give us that equity with the votes. Some votes are worth more than others, and that's not right. And that leads into the Section 15 of the Charter, which says that every individual is equal before and under the law, and in particular can't be discriminated. And we're used to the discrimination of race or national or ethnic origin or religion or sex or something like that. But what if your discrimination is based on what are the things that you believe? What are your priorities? What if the discrimination is, I'm discriminated against because I would like to have a green future. I would like to have an environmentally oriented set of policies. Okay? But those voters are so spread out across Canada that they have very little opportunity to get that kind of representation. So those are the two cores of this. The problem here is, however, that we're taught that the Charter is framed in terms of individual rights. And most of the research on voting has been done at the party level. And you'll notice that those simulations that I talked about earlier was based on, the Liberals got 40% of the vote, but they got 54% of the seats, and that's not fair. Well, that alludes to sort of a party right, okay? But parties don't have rights under the Constitution. It's individuals. And so as part of this Charter challenge, we need to go back to the drawing board and ask, so what are some metrics? What are some ways to measure this disparity from the individual standpoint instead of from the party standpoint? So first of all, what does it mean to be represented? In my mind, this goes back to that story that I told earlier about going to see my local MP about my concerns with income inequality and having that MP listen intently to me. But in the end, I got the feeling that no, my concerns were not going to be represented in Parliament. Okay. So being represented means being able to have some confidence that your voice will be heard in Parliament, that your representative, that one of your representatives at least, will take your opinion seriously enough to represent it, to advocate for it in Parliament. Okay. And in a system where many of us, our only representative, our only MP is somebody we did not vote for, that we did not agree with to vote for, that's an untenable situation. So here's what we call a representation metric of Canada through time. And that is, what percentage of the voters actually voted for the person who was elected? And here in recent years, it's been right around 50%. oftentimes just a little bit less than 50% of the voters actually voted for the person who was elected. In the early years of the Confederation, it was someplace between 50 and 60%. If you work at that same metric for other countries that use proportional representation, as my colleague Tony Hodgson has done, here's Canada, about 50%. Norway had about 80% here in 2 elections. Ireland, which uses single transferable vote, had about 75% in 3 elections. But in all of those cases, there was an MP that you could go to that was much more likely to be somebody that you voted for, that you had at least some degree of agreement with. Another metric we've been working on is we call the legislative power share. What it's premised on is that in an ideal world, we would each have an equal share of the power in the legislature. We'd all have an MP that would represent us there. But in fact, as we've seen, roughly 50% of us don't, right? That's this left-hand bar that is 50%. We have that 50% has an effective power of 0. So where did that power go, right? That MP has an equal power with all of the other MPs, but is in a sense only represented half the electorate. And so that other half has the power that the first half doesn't, right? And in fact is distributed here, some people having more than twice as much power, some people having 1.5 to 2 times the power, and so on. Why is it that some people are, why is this distribution like this? Well, that has to do with the fact that ridings don't have the same number of voters in them, and that a voter in a small riding will have a larger share of the power than a voter in a large riding, and so on. So anyway, this graph looks very bad. And ideally, it would have one tall green bar right there that would represent the power of all of us, that would all have a power of 1. Okay. If we simulate a single transferable vote, we get a graph that it's not perfect, but it's a whole lot better, okay? In that even under single transferable vote, some people don't have an MP that they voted for. There are more people here in the center, okay? And some still get, because the ridings are various sizes and things, some people still have more than their fair share. But it is much better than what we get under first past the post. If we take these, for first past the post, if we take these bars and stack them on each other, we can then show in a single graph how it looked through time for Canada, for Canadian elections. And we see that back here in the early days of Confederation, back in 1867, for example, there were many more voters in the center, in that, that had the appropriate amount of power. And fewer voters had no power or excess power. But that's been squeezed down over time. And a big factor here is the rise of multiple parties in the 30s and 40s and 50s. Back here, Canada was essentially a 2-party system, and as we've had the rise of the CCF and NDP and so on here, it's become more fractured and harder to, and that sweet spot has diminished considerably. Another thing that we've looked at is another metric that we've been working with is borrowed from economic literature, and that is the Gini coefficient or the Lorenz curve. It's been used a lot for income inequality. And here, for example, we have a graph on the left from Statistics Canada about income in Canada. And what this says is that if we look at the bottom curve here, this one, that's the total income for, that's the market income, what you actually get paid. And what it shows is that here you have the share of the population. So if you're looking at the bottom 20% of the population, they get a very small, maybe 2 or 3% of the income from the work that they do. If you go up to half of the population here, they earn maybe 20% of the total income earned by everybody. If you go up to 80%, the bottom 80% of the population earn about a little less than 60% of the total earnings. Okay? And we're looking at it the other way. If you look at the top 20% of the population here, they get about 40% of the income. If we transfer those same kind of concepts into vote share, okay, well, the bottom 50% of the population have no power and accumulate no power through here. And then it starts to climb rapidly, so that the top, say 20% here, top 20% of the voters have about 40% of the power. This is considered fairly, if everything was fair, then this line would track the 45-degree parallel, or the 45-degree line. And if everything was fair, this line here would track that one. But these simulations, both the ones that I've been doing here, as well as the ones that I did for that first part of the lecture with those line drawings, there's a number of issues that are hard to take into account, that we have to struggle with. One is, how do we generate ranked ballots from the data we have? We don't have data about how Canadians would vote with ranked ballots. The approach that I've taken is a transition function. I say, we know for a particular riding how many voted Liberal, how many voted Conservative, how many voted NDP, and given on survey data, let's guess what percentage of the Liberal voters would list NDP as their second choice, or what percentage of the Conservative voters would list Liberal as their second choice. It's not very satisfying. What I told the MPs on the Electoral Reform Committee, though, is that if we can show that under a wide variety of these made-up circumstances, with this transition function, under a wide variety of those situations, we still get proportionality, then it's reasonable to believe that under a real system would get proportional results as well. Another approach is a spatial approach, where essentially you build a two-dimensional grid of candidates and voters, and then use a Euclidean distance function from the voters to the candidates to determine the order in which they vote. Okay. Another issue is defining utility functions that are reasonable across a number of voting systems. How do you vote? How do you determine whether whether a candidate is represented, in first past the post? Well, do they have an MP that they voted for? But in single transferable vote, they might have 2 MPs that they voted for, or 3. How do you take that into account? And another issue is defining an index that captures the representation equity in a single value instead of a graph that's easier to deal with. So I'd just like to close now with just a very brief summary of why I support proportional representation. First off is fairness. I think that people ought to be represented fairly, and that I should have an MP that I feel comfortable with representing me, and that if 40% of the voters vote for a party, they should have 40% of the power, not more, not less. I think every vote should count, and it does with proportional representation. I like that proportional representation tends to give more gender and other diversity, and I like that because diversity gives better results. It gives better outcomes, better decisions. I like that proportional representation system encourages more collaboration, less polarization. I think it gives better government because it can avoid dictators, less policy lurch, better decisions due to the increased diversity. And we see better outcomes in things that I care about in particular when we look at systems that use proportional representation, that in other countries that use proportional representation. So, I'd like to have a time for questions and responses that will occur when we meet in person in class. Thanks for watching this far, and I'm looking forward to engaging with you.